Welcome to the 21st episode of SecuriTEA Crumpets, where we host security professionals each month to talk about different security topics. Today, I'm delighted to have Josh Liburdi, I think it's pronounced, on the show. Josh was a consultant at CrowdStrike, where he focused on incident response and network monitoring for Fortune 500 companies. Josh is a threat hunting extraordinaire, where he's helped build or evolve incident response programs at GE, Target, Splunk, and more recently, Brex. Josh has presented trainings at Blackhat, Bsides, and has built open source tooling. More recently, this was Substation at Brex. Welcome, Josh. Welcome to the stream.
Hey, thanks for having me. Super excited to chat with you.
Awesome. So I always like to start off with a little icebreaker. And so like where you currently live, if you don't want to share that information, we can skip the icebreaker. But where you currently live, like, is there anything that you would recommend for people to do / visit in your regional area?
Yeah, this one is super easy. I live near the Napa Valley in California, so what I recommend people do is drink wine.
Perfect. Do you have a favorite winery?
Oh, wow. Honestly, I'm kind of a convert to wine over the past couple years after moving here. I really like The Prisoner. They make a really good red blend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, the best wine I actually drank, and I don't know if it's, what people will get upset about this, but it was called Educated Guess. I don't know where it's actually
Yeah.
from, but it's actually a really nice wine. I just remember that being like very tasty and very, I don't drink that much wine these days. I've moved more back into the beer / seltzer region. But if you do ever want to if you're ever in Boston, that's the only place I've ever found this beer. Just listeners watching this, there is a great beer called, it's called, oh Christ, I can't remember the name. It's called Boomstick by Lord Hobo Brewing. So it's like I'm assuming it's a spin off that movie where it's like, this is my boomstick. So
Oh, sure.
if you ever find a thing which says Lord Hobo Brewing with the tag boomstick, definitely drink that alcohol. So you obviously, we come from different paths, but kind of in the same realm of security. So you've worked in different fields, but I would love to kind of hear more about your career background and how things began for you in the threat hunting space / incident response / consulting ordeal.
Yeah. I've been in I usually call it like security operations or blue team or threat defense. I've been in that industry for almost 10 years. Started my career on a really big team, working at General Electric on their CERT as a detection analyst, is what we called it back then, not detection engineering. Um, and from there, kind of just like, moved throughout my career into different spaces, but still within the industry. So went to CrowdStrike and did incident response consulting. Went to a place called Squirrel. It was later acquired by AWS and did security research. Eventually found my way back to more, I guess, private blue team SecOps kind of work. Worked on the teams at Target, on internal teams at Splunk, and now at Brex. So kind of have seen a lot of what that part of the industry has to offer, working on products, working as a consultant, working with like really big internal teams, really small internal teams. It's definitely helped a lot, I think, kind of shape my view of how you approach the problems in this space.
Very cool. What would you say like has been like one of your like more fun moments in like your career so far?
Huh. It's an interesting question. So I think there's two. When I was a consultant at CrowdStrike, you just very regularly saw insane things because you were jumping from breach to breach. And I didn't even work as many breaches as some of my peers at the time, but we would regularly see things like with some of the visibility you get with the tools at CrowdStrike, right? You would see attackers on the command line, like you would see them make mistakes, end up on a host and think they were somewhere else in the environment and try to use commands on the operating system that don't exist. Fun things like that. Sometimes you'd see them do things like uninstall security software and replace it with their malware. Um, that's a fun one. Just week to week, really cool, insane things that are just kind of like on the bleeding edge of what I'd call like adversary tradecraft. And then on the other side of it, is building things to combat that. So I did a lot of that at Target, where when I was there, we open sourced a tool called Strelka, which is we called it an enterprise file scanning tool, and we were regularly using that to identify attackers, and they quite often had no clue how we were doing it. Um, and we've done a little bit of that at Brex, and plan to do more of it at Brex as the team grows.
Awesome. We'll definitely get into the things you've been doing at Brexton a little bit later. But I thought this would be a good exercise because, the way that I, see my realm is like, you have people doing breaches. I have like when Log4j comes out, like obviously I'm sure it's similar paths too, because you want to detect like people exploiting that. But obviously I want to, find where that's vulnerable in code. So there's kind of like cross kind of, definitions there, I would say. Um, I would love to kind of, put like bring this next part of this kind of conversation into the thought through like the lens of a newcomer. So let's say I was wanting to like move into threat hunting for the first time, and it's either adjacent, like new to me, or I come from a completely different field. Like, what would you say would be like the key things that you probably want to like learn from like a fundamental level to be able to do threat hunting or like do instant response type things?
Wow, yeah, it's a complicated question. I mean, there are entire like series of blog posts and
Okay.
things written about your career. But here's what I'll say is, you know, a safe way in is through um like a networking background, like like switches and routers and things like that, IT help desk. Those are easy pivots into an early career or mid-career security role. In my space, usually that pivot is into like a security operations center where you're looking at alerts. Those alerts might be written by like a detection engineering team, or they might just be, given to the SOC by security appliances that you just buy, right? And then from there, with if you're working in a security operations center and there's I'd say a mature leadership team like overseeing things, there should be opportunities to expand out from there. So that's where you would sort of graduate into incident response, or you would graduate into threat hunting. That's a really common path. I'll say that for the most part, you don't start off threat hunting. It's a almost like an apex skill in this part of the industry, because it is a blend of incident response, detection engineering, threat intelligence, um, DevOps in some cases engineering. There are roles that are a little safer to start in than threat hunting.
That definitely makes sense. And I didn't expect to like get that kind of response, but I think it was very thought out. So thank you, thank you for uh, dealing with my very mundane questions, which technically are very, very like complicated to answer. Um, I'm gonna jump into the let's say I, through the lens of like someone who might start a company for the first time, and they have some let's say they've they have a networking background, they are like they have use like some of the tools today that do this type of stuff. And let's say you just joined and you're building out something for the first time, like let's say like you're building out a SIEM or something. Like what would be like the first thing like you would want to like kind of figure out across the organization before you could even like start like anywhere?
Hmm. Yeah. Are we assuming you actually have the data you need to do your job? Because that's not true a lot of the times.
I think that's a great starting conversation, right? Like so like like what kind of data do you need?
Yeah, so I kind of think about this kind of work. You can kind of like segment it into classifications or categories of data. So there's data that describes activity happening on a network, like connections between servers, data that describes activities on systems, like process execution, files being written to disk, data that identifies like access, like remote access from, say, like through your identity provider. Um, those are pretty high quality data sets. And I think a lot of teams today, if you have nothing, it's really hard to beat like a off the shelf like EDR product, like an endpoint detection and response product, like a CrowdStrike Falcon or Carbon Black or or whomever else. I'm not here to pitch for the vendors, but it's that's for your hosts, and then if you're a cloud company, cloud first, right? You're looking at your cloud service providers logs, so that could be CloudTrail or the equivalent logs in GCP and Azure. So it really is about like understanding what you're there to protect. It informs the logs you need. Um, and then if we say you have those logs, it's about getting an understanding of like two things. Like one is, what is normal in the environment? So like what is just kind of like the day-to-day cadence of operations for whatever the business is, right? It could be how the cloud works. It could be how employees have access to different services they utilize, or what applications they're running. There's part of that, but then it's also understanding, the risk to the organization and trying to understand how a threat actor or adversary might compromise the organization. So if you take that intelligence-driven approach, which I'm a big fan of, usually it will lead you in the right direction, assuming you can figure all that out, which isn't easy.
That was, again, I threw another curveball at you, and that was a very great kind of thoughtful piece on that. So I kind of obviously like to do a bit of research when I'm interviewing someone, and I noticed that you had like a playbook on your GitHub. Is that still relevant today? Like, which kind of like documents the kind of like breakdown of what this kind of what you were talking about in the first piece, when it comes to like a newcomer who might want to like figure out like the types of assets, or what you would class as like informational data that you want to collect.
Yeah, I think you might be referring to the hunting pocket guide I put on my
Yes.
GitHub. It was kind of like just a backstory. It was kind of like created as like a little bit of a joke, in that like I just needed to like a place to like point people to like if they had questions about hunting. It was just like, just go to this thing. It has all the little details you might need, and then you can figure out the rest on your own. Um, but I still use it personally. I kind of take it with me company to company and update it. And yeah, I think it definitely gives you like a push into hunting, and it gives you a push into like understanding the data sets you could use and the way you should think about things, but doesn't like explicitly tell you step by step how to find like a certain kind of adversary command and control implant, right? Or a certain kind of technique that an adversary might use to get into your organization. It's really just yeah, pocket guide kind of style.
Yeah, gotcha. So, I mean, a lot of people like always like when I was in the pen testing days, consulting days, you used to always carry things like the RTFM. I'm not going to say what it actually stands for on the stream. I should, but maybe I won't right now. Maybe I'll add it in at the end. Uh, you would bring like a pocket guide with you, because you always go into like a new environment where you might not always remember the type of commands that you're doing, or like the types of, like, let's say like you've been like living in like AWS land, like the concepts might be a little bit different in a different cloud environment, for example. So it's always good to kind of have a reference guide, regardless of like your tenure in your career, I think, at least for me.
Yeah, I agree. I'll actually give a shout out. There's a book I have the shelf above my monitor right here. It's called The Operator Handbook.
Hmm.
Um, it's kind of, I guess I wouldn't say it is exactly the blue team equivalent of RTFM, but pretty close. And if someone is looking for that like translation guide, or that kind of like pocket guide to the industry, it's a good place to start.
Awesome. Um, so I'm gonna throw another spicy take out here, and obviously I've heard through your colleagues that and you've been in the industry for a while now, and we kind of get into our own solid ways, but I've heard that people in your industry are now using the word THRUNT to explain threat intelligence. Sorry, threat hunting. Sorry, not intelligence. Threat hunting. And I hear you hate this, and I would love to kind of like understand why.
Um, yeah, there's just like, I'm not really easy to offend, but there's just some words that when you hear them, you just like your spine just kind of creaks, and you just like feel like you want to just like thrash someone. And I feel like whenever someone uses the word threat around me, I'm just like, why would you ever even say that? But I mean, I'm not here to gatekeep. Like, if someone wants to have fun and call it thrunting, like, I think it's ridiculous, but you know, good on you, I guess.
I just feel like that's kind of like a stocking filler you might get sometime, like the like pocketbook or something.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I guess if so, here's the other thing I was thinking about too is like, a vendor has not as far as I know, a vendor has not yet used the word THRUNT. So how legitimate can it be if a vendor hasn't tried to co-opt it yet?
That's actually a valid point because they definitely take some words and use them to the extreme sometimes. So I could definitely imagine that being something people probably should think about. But it's the same thing. Like people were using the word crypto. Crypto means cryptography rather than cryptocurrency, and like all these things kind of definitely grinds a lot of people's gears. Like when you start like leveraging things. I know it's not exactly the same, but I could imagine how there's a cross collaboration there. Um, awesome. So obviously some people on the stream might not know, or this recording might not know like what an APT is. But I would, love to kind of get your take on like like is an APT actually an APT, or just are they actually like just persistent? Like, what is your kind of thoughts around that area?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of history and how you kind of talk about this subject, but I guess for the viewers, APT usually refers to, it's an acronym, right? Advanced Persistent Threat. I think it was coined by Mandiant during the APT when they released the APT-1 report, or people watching this who actually know will probably be angry if I try to attribute the actual source. I know there are folks at Mandiant and former Mandiant folks that were definitely involved in this. But in any case, I think there's like the history lesson of it, which is that APT is usually used to describe like a well-funded nation state adversary that is very persistently targeting organizations for usually intellectual property is historically how it's been. Um, so what happened is, APT-1 report comes out, Mandiant continues the use of the APT acronym, others in the industry pick it up. It's kind of become, just the way you talk about nation state adversaries. And then it's also, I think, even been applied to like like persistent cyber criminal groups and other types of like threat actors. Um, my opinion on it is like basically that anytime someone says APT, what they really should just be talking about is persistence, and that's the differentiator of classes of attacker. I would say is not necessarily that one attacker or threat group is more advanced than another. It's what you really need to be concerned about is their level of persistence. So like it's kind of like the difference of saying, our network is being scanned, right? The noise of the internet, right? Everything is being scanned all the time. Threat actor may do that. They may find a vulnerable server, they may compromise it, come into your network, cause some havoc, you kick them out, and they don't come back. Compared to a persistent attacker, which will just keep coming over and over and over until they achieve whatever their mission is. And I think that you don't have to be advanced to be persistent. Sometimes the persistence does lead to advancement. And I think the industry has somewhat started to shift the conversation away from advancement to just talking about persistent groups. So I've been pretty happy to see that transition happen.
Very cool. And would you say that, I think it was a great kind of like story there, but would you say that all APTs would be treated as equals in this space? I know we've had, offline conversations about, nation state actors, but is there anything that you've seen, or like, through stories, where like things might not always be the same?
Yeah, I think there's like in the intelligence community, there's like I can't really speak to any particular group being better than another, but if you're thinking about nation states, they're composed of many groups that have different missions. So, and like every large country in the world has one, right? Um, and so in some cases, I've worked at places where you can see the level. So it's almost like for some of these groups, it's their job. Like literally, it's a government job they're working. Their mission is to break into another country to gain information or steal information. Um, and in some cases, I've worked and seen data from incidents where, like, the engagement from the adversary was kind of sloppy. Like they just kind of weren't effective, and you could see that in like how slow they were moving. You could see that in the commands they're executing. You could see that in the errors they're making, right? And then the next day, like things get a lot more interesting and the cadence of the adversary gets a lot better and they stop making so many mistakes. And then you're like, okay, like maybe they shifted a new team onto this operation because suddenly things are looking a little different. Um, I think there's definitely like concepts of like A team and B teams for nation states where you know, the official overseeing the operation might pull a team off or pull individuals off the op to bring in someone who can get the job done, so to speak. Um, I'm kind of like talking about it as if it's just a very boring government job because like it kind of is, which is weird. Like their job is just to break into companies and steal data or monitor. So it's interesting. And there's some groups that you know, like a government job will very rigidly follow like national holidays, things like that. Like you might not see like a Chinese APT group like working during Chinese New Year, right? They should go quiet then. Um, yeah, it's an interesting space when you have the level of visibility to actually monitor what an attacker is doing live in your network.
Yeah, we're definitely going to probably dive a bit more into that later. It's kind of funny because if you think even just government jobs in general, like you see it in the consulting space too. You might like, at least if I break it down into like the AppSec realm, the way that I would see it is that you bring a consultant into or like a team to go and like assess like an application that you know might be like a new framework or like could be like a new JavaScript framework, for example. But you bring someone in who is mainly background in PHP. Sometimes you might like rotate those people out because obviously someone reviewing PHP probably doesn't really understand all the nuances with, you know, let's say JavaScript. So you bring in someone else, kind of like a switch them out kind of thing. So it's just funny to like to hear like even, you know, nation state or like people trying to break into systems, you know, illegally is kind of doing the same thing that maybe consultancies might do as well, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, there's actually that's a really interesting point because what some of these groups do, right, under the same umbrella of their leader or official or whomever or government, let's keep it kind of generic. They
Yes.
share tools, right? So there are like they literally might have developers like building the tool for an operator to run. So the operator doesn't necessarily need to know how the tool works. They just know they need to run it. And there might be operators who know how to run those tools better than others. In some cases, the tools might be shared across groups, and that knowledge share doesn't happen. Um, to some people, I might just be describing a startup, right? Like this is kind of just the way things are. And so, like, yeah, you have your experts on the teams and across groups. And the reason I bring it up is because this is actually one of the causes I think of misattribution of attack activity. Because when you see that, because a lot of the time we only know a tool is being used, and it's a lot harder to attribute. You can't directly attribute tool use to a threat group, and this has gotten just much worse in the threat intelligence space with the proliferation of open source tooling. Like it's not open source, but Cobalt Strike. It's a very popular toolkit for after you gain access to an organization, you know, maintaining access and connectivity. Like everyone uses Cobalt Strike. Like it's just the thing you use now. Like why would you use anything else? And there are other things you can use, but the point is you can't like say that you know this is Chinese APT because they're using Cobalt Strike, or this is so and so ransomware gang because they're using Cobalt Strike. It's very complicated, and I've just talked to some analysts that maybe haven't learned yet that you know tools are not 100% attribution proof, so to speak.
Yeah, I've seen that time and time again in like the like at least the AppSec space as well, where like obviously everyone uses Burp or Zap or you know, like people are releasing all these like, you know, blind XSS tools or like things which are trying to get like out of bound responses and stuff. Like I'm sure like there are like nation states that have like spun up the collaborator which allows you to get like out of bound responses in like Burp, for example. So it's definitely interesting to kind of hear like how, you know, basically everything is the same if you kind of like look at it in a different lens. Um, there's one thing, like obviously, you know, this is a very loaded question, and I don't know if there's a simple answer to this, but you know, obviously, there's going to be certain types of organizations that are probably more kind of targeted in these kind of scenarios. But like, what is the kind of core principle to being more resistant? As you know, obviously the persistence component, but like, what is it like the kind of resistant, like you know, antidote that you might want to start trying to deploy to kind of prevent persistent actors attacking you?
Geez,
Very
you
loaded. We can we
know,
can.
let's talk about it. I mean, if I had figured this out, I'd probably be running my own company, right?
Yes.
But so there's like multiple components to it. It's a combination of visibility, prevention and detection. So the ability to disrupt an attacker before they've caused harm, right, would be prevention. The ability to know what they're doing would be visibility, and the ability to identify that activity would be detection. And you really want those three things to work in kind of to be harmonious to be resistant. And then you have to apply that to all facets of your business, right? From the cloud to the corporate endpoints to the networks to it gets very complicated very fast. So, you know, I think let's talk about things that don't work, right? Like security by obscurity doesn't work. Um, Pretending like you'll never be breached doesn't work. Um, Not investing in tools will definitely lead to one day someone will have a bad day, whether you're there or not. If you're on the team that made the decision, right? I kind of have. I wouldn't say like my opinion is 100% assume breach, but I think that if you're if you spent any amount of time in this industry and you don't have some thought in your head that, yeah, one day this could happen where I work and we need to be prepared for that, like that's to me, that's the preparedness part of incident response is knowing that it can happen and then actually taking steps to, okay, if it does happen, this is what we're going to do. This is how we handle this case. This is how we handle another case. These are the tools we put in place to make it less bad, right? Sometimes your job is
Mhm.
just to make things less bad, is what I'll say.
It kind of like if I was to like put it into just development terms, it's kind of like you're trying to be. I mean, like it basically just is DevOps with SRE type stuff, right? Because you want to be able to have like reliability in the things, and you need to have true visibility into your systems. So it's kind of, if you take it from a different spin, it's kind of in the same kind of lane as that, but just obviously very much attributed to like system integrity and like making sure things haven't been compromised. It's
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, we on a totally different topic, but the way the team at Brex operates is very SRE like. Um, I think there's positives and negatives to that. I wouldn't recommend every team do it, but it is kind of like that. I mean, you can think about this problem as a reliability problem to some extent. Makes sense.
cool. So we're gonna move away from APTs or just persistent people. I'm a persistent person, so I'm going to ask you lots of questions. So when we talk about lots of different various information coming in from here and there, like how do you handle the sea of data? Like I know, like you talked about you break things down into different components, but what is like the fundamental thing that someone needs to do to be able to make sure that their sources are kind of being collected in the correct way and analyzed, I guess.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a data engineering problem. I think at the end of the day, it's and like a data engineering problem. There are so many facets to it. There's are all the systems sending us data? Are they sending us the right data? Is the data being delivered to the location that we expect it to be delivered to? Like, we build systems to address these things. Observability, I think, is a really big part of it. Just understanding the state of all the systems that are sending you telemetry. Because the thing about it is, like, I think this is the thing that a lot of practitioners don't really get, or I would say I don't really hear this conversation a lot, which is that you buy a tool from a vendor or multiple tools from vendors. Like I used to work at CrowdStrike, I worked at Splunk. Like let's say you use Splunk as your SIM and CrowdStrike is sending data to Splunk. You're really not involved in that conversation as a practitioner. Like the data just gets there. But how do you trust that the data is actually there on time and that like it's accurate? Because any because the thing is like you're looking at that data, but there may not be a team validating it. And if the data can lie to you, is kind of what I'm getting at. Like if the data lies to you, you can make the wrong decision. You can think that you're safe when you're not, or you can think that you're unsafe when you are safe. And so we think about that a lot on our team at Brex, where we try to like be very observant of the state of the systems and the data to ensure like that it's accurate, it's being delivered on time, and all of that is just part of making sure like we're making good decisions when we go to use that data and trust it.
Hmm. I definitely could see. I guess it's the same in the data science realm. Like, how do you make sure your data is correct? And I guess the whole AI thing popping up right now. I'm sure that we could dive into that, but I'm not. I have no expertise in that. So, but it's just definitely interesting to like, kind of hear like the data needs to be correct. I remember there was conversations like when people used to do like PCI type compliance stuff, and it's like, well, how do you actually know that the records from like everything from the stores are actually correct, because sometimes things are cached locally for a long time and they get sent in an entire day. And I know, and people used to be able to steal like the chip and pin devices that it was basically storing it on the device. So the data actually wasn't going away to the remote systems and stuff. So in the same space, it's kind of really interesting to like make sure like, how much and when should you be logging information? How do you, make sure that it's actually going at the right time, and like make sure it can't obviously be tampered with as well, where it's being stored.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, and then the other parts are, um, do you have all the data you need to paint the picture of what may have happened, right?
Mm,
Because your data given to you by your EDR, which is usually process execution data, files written to disk, things like that, is not telling you much about what's happening on the network. So you might need network data, and you need a way to join that data together in a cohesive, easy to use way for an analyst or a practitioner or responder to actually like make a decision with it. So there's that like defense in depth. I think is kind of getting into that concept. But then there's also like at a practitioner level, like how do we ensure that the decisions and conclusions I'm reaching are the same as yours, right? How do we get that consistency across the team? And sometimes you can't. Like sometimes it's such a human driven process that you can't take that human element out of it, and that is the human is the most important part of it, right? Let's bring up AI. Like the human is the best part of all of this and the most important like decision maker and everything. um so there's going to be variance between how we make how we draw different conclusions. um but I think there is like there are things we can do from a technical point of view to try to push all the people working on this problem to make better decisions, and that's kind of the goal.
that's interesting. And like when you mentioned like kind of like taking like two pieces of data and putting it together, is that like the kind of concept where people talk about data enrichment to kind of like, make data better? Or okay, cool. Um, so I have a few questions around like sea of data, right? Like, it's really interesting from like I don't know, like I would love to like know, is there a difference between like a small company and like the data that they have, or like, like let's say a company that has like warehouses and has stores and that kind of stuff, or it's a multi-cloud on-tenant kind of environment, or is it acquisition heavy? They have multiple like environments. Like, do things change? Is it harder as things get like larger, like because you have more data points, or is it always the same problem?
Yeah. Wow, you're full of tough questions today.
That's
So here's the thing, right? Is that like there's two angles to it. There's the data angle, and then there's the threat actor angle. And let's talk about the threat actor angle first, because the threat actor doesn't care what data you have or what your environment is or who you are. Maybe they care who you are because that's why they're targeting you. But for the most part, like they're going to go after any company, person, organization that they think they can get value out of. And I would say today the highest risk kind of threat actor groups are ransomware groups, because they have just proven over and over that they have no morals. They will ransom a hospital. There's like actual like cost of life kind of like things happening with some of these groups. And maybe more relevant to like small companies, everything from like small businesses to startups to medium-sized companies all the way to like your Fortune 10. Like they will get money out of you. They will they the ransom is the point, and getting paid for that is the goal. So from a threat actor point of view, if you're talking ransomware, you could just be just at risk as a small business as you could be as a startup, as any of these other companies. So I would say that a small business is probably not going to be targeted by, well, I would say usually a small business wouldn't be targeted by the Chinese government or another nation state government. Don't mean to just call it the Chinese, but it's less likely than, say, a Fortune 50 company, right? There's a lot of research you can do in your industry if you're kind of in these like, I'd say from a if you're working on a incident response team or a detection and intelligence team for a startup, there's research you can do about your industry, talk to your peers in the industry, see what intellectual property or try to understand the threat model, right? Is kind of what it gets down to, and that's just the threat actor angle. So if we then talk about data, does it get harder if you're small or big when it comes to data and the systems you're using? Like absolutely. I've worked in companies that barely had a cloud presence. And their threat model is different than a company that's all in the cloud. Or like even say, you work at a company that's all AWS and then you go to a company that's all GCP. Like you're learning a different ecosystem. It's the problems are very different. But from a scale point of view, there is a there is a point where the scale just kind of becomes insurmountable. And in my experience, it's somewhere around like, I don't know, 50,000 employees, like that kind of thing. Like anything under 50,000 employees is probably manageable for a really, really talented small team, like absurdly talented. But you probably don't actually want that. You want like a less talented team of more people that are diverse. But once you kind of get above that like 50,000 mark, like things become harder just because the diversity of your systems becomes more complex, the diversity of the business operations becomes more complex. Like, when I worked at GE, like GE was really big. They were, running trains and building jet engines and making appliances and all of that. And like the opportunity for a threat actor there is enormous. Like, it's one of the biggest companies of the world. And it's a lot different working at a startup, I think. But it all like eventually it all comes back to all of these companies need the same kind of data. Like whether you work on a team like this at a startup or a big company, like you need to understand what's happening on your hosts. You need to understand what's happening in your networks, what kind of access people are granted in the network, things like that. That doesn't change. But the scale of the operations changes things, and your threat actors and who's targeting you definitely change the conversation.
Wow. Okay. You definitely gave me a lot to think about myself. I'm going to move away from the hard questions, and maybe this is also a hard question, but I think it's definitely different. So you were talking, obviously you've built Substation. We'll get to that very shortly. But I want to talk about the build or buy situation for this, because no matter like what industry you're in, like if it's sales, you probably want to probably buy Salesforce because of XYZ. If you're in like security and you're doing SaaS, you'd probably want to go and take a look at the Gartner quadrant or like the XYZ and maybe buy a SaaS tool, because building a SaaS tool would be hard. But I guess it's the same thing in your industry as well, where do you want to go and just build something to kind of like do all this ingestion? Do you want to buy Splunk? Do you want to use something else that's free, etc., and maintain it? So the question is like, should you build everything or should you buy everything, or is there an in-between best kind of like approach that people might want to take?
How much money do you have? That's the question. No, I mean,
Let's start with that. Let's break it up into like multiple pieces. Let's say you have no money, like you're very small team. The industry is kind of in the flop right now. Not even just industry, like the market today is just really bad, right? So budgets are shrinking. So let's say we have a small budget. What would be something you might recommend?
yeah, I mean, so you want to hire smart people, right? And then just give them room to do the right thing is usually the best investment you can make. And that doesn't mean like build or buy. That's just like the baseline, right? But I think if you have very little budget, it kind of goes back to the conversation about threat actors and understanding risk and critical systems and crown jewels, like where in your organization, what is the most important thing, and then you protect that or focus on that. As your budget increases, then you can talk about protecting the entire organization. And I think a lot of companies today, even startups, they are hiring for people like in this part of the industry. They're making the investments, and then you kind of talk about, okay, do you buy something or build something? And We have this conversation a lot at Brex, and my opinion, on this team that I work on now is that we try to buy as much as we can. And that's purely because, if it addresses 80% of our use cases, why would we invest engineering time to building something new or reinventing the wheel, right? Um, it has to be there has to be a very compelling reason or series of reasons to build something if we could have just bought something. Um, and generally speaking, when you buy, in theory, you're lowering the complexity for the team, I think is the idea, right? Like you would buy or in some cases maybe use like free software to satisfy a use case, and it gets you well enough to your to the solution, whatever it might be. So then it's probably a question why we would build Substation, right? Because things like that exist. So why would we build a thing that already exists?
That's my next question.
Perfect. So we could have not built it. We could have run Logstash. We could have run FluentD. We could have paid for Cribble. At the time we started building it, the tools that were available to us in the open source space didn't fit the model the team was trying to go for. Like, I've worked on teams that run at much larger scale, and this kind of goes back to the question about like, if you're a small company, like how do you deal with the scale problem, right? Because like when we started building this thing a couple of years ago, I knew we were going to have to deal with the scale problem eventually. Like eventually it would catch up with us, and if we didn't think about that ahead of time, we were going to be in trouble, because then we were going to be swapping out tools and changing architectures, and you really don't want that. So from day one, it was built to scale, and it was designed and built to scale in a way where we don't need to touch it. So we don't need to manage servers. We don't think about sizing Kafka clusters, which is maybe one of my least favorite activities in this industry anyway. So I'm trying to think, from conception to like production beta, it was like 3 months, 3 or 4 months of work. It was not that long. And after we had started rolling it to production, I think I had a really good sense that like this was going to work at scale. And then I think in the announcement blog post for Substation is where I have the graph of like one day our scale just 10x'd in a couple hours. And it went from like, I forget what the range was, but it jumped like several thousands of events being like processed per second from, like thousands. So like you can't really address that kind of scale with traditional systems. And in this case, I'm talking about serverless versus whatever non-serverless is, servers, I suppose. So like we built it like to be like really friendly for us from an ops point of view, but also because we knew we were going to ship a lot of features really fast. Like, I've worked with Logstash, I've worked with Kafka, and obviously spent a lot of time working with Splunk. Like those tools are really great at like querying data and moving data between like systems, right? Like that's the data pipeline part of it, but not really good at like modeling data or enriching data at scale. And that's like the other half of why we built it, to be honest, is the ability to so this is the key point, right? Whenever you build call it a custom detection engineering system, or like any custom IR system, anything, one of your main goals should be I want to lower the time it takes me to disrupt an adversary. Like time to disrupt an adversary is an amazing metric if you've never like considered it. So like we observe an adversary doing something today. Can we deploy tech by tomorrow that disrupts that activity? And that's like one of the like I guess unannounced, unmentioned goals of a system like Substation is to be able to like see an adversary do something and then build something really fast that can disrupt that activity.
Do you have any like examples of like what you mean by that component? Like say like is it like building like a module for a substation and then deploying that out and it just rolls out? Um,
Yeah. Yeah. a great question. So like one of the recent examples is we just shipped version 07, so we're still not version 10 or 10.
Mhm.
And in that in the latest release, we've got enrichment processors for DNS, so querying DNS. Very basic thing, right? It's not really that unusual of a feature for a system like this. Like all modern systems have it, like Logstash, Splunk, et cetera. They all have a way to query DNS, but they usually only query and translate IP addresses to domains and the reverse. So it's doing the reverse lookup and the forward lookup. But we've added a couple other features because there's some enrichment services you can use that actually give you threat intelligence through DNS. And one of the ones I mentioned in the release is, God, I'm going to say their name wrong. The Team Cymru. I forget how to pronounce their name, but they they have this thing called the malware hash registry, and it's multiple endpoints on the internet. You can query it through Whois, through DNS, through HTTPS, and you just give it a hash of like an executable, and it gives you a response of how many antivirus engines have flagged it as malicious. And so, and for DNS, it's all through text records, TXT. So we added that to Substation, and I was like, yeah, now we can just like send all of our EDR logs and query their malware hash registry, and we just get threat intelligence for free, that kind of thing. So that's, I think, for us in this project, it's about releasing new, we call them processors for processing data. So it's about releasing new processors in response to things we see attackers doing. At Target, when we were working on and released Strelka, which is the file scanning software, we were like regularly making updates based on things attackers were doing, because they like that like kind of system doesn't really exist in the vendor space. And so attackers would do things like they would, gosh, what can I say that's not going to get me in trouble? I mean, they would, compile files in a way and leave artifacts behind in the compilation of those files that they didn't know they were leaking indicators. So I'm talk about indicators of compromise.
Mhm.
They didn't know that they were leaking indicators, but we knew they were leaking them. And we regularly use those indicators to flag on activity. So in some ways, building systems like this that you can just rapidly like iterate on to disrupt an attacker feels like cheating. It's like one of the few opportunities you have against an attacker where it feels like you're just goofing on them, like you're just cheating them, and they don't have a clue.
I kind of love that. The way that I would like put this into like just an app development perspective, right, is that um, you can use like a SaaS solution, but like using like just doing SaaS alone sometimes isn't enough for like things, which so like you might actually want to like build like a third party like component that actually goes and does other things outside of your general SaaS process to kind of like enrich that information and provide you information. The same for like if someone's building like a password strength meter thing, you probably don't want to just directly build one yourself. You just want to go and use like the have I been pwned kind of libraries with like what Cloudflare introduced, where you can make sure the password hasn't already been compromised in a secure way, right? So I kind of love the fact that in the same like in this kind of the same lane, you're basically taking components of what other people have done and like making sure that those things can automatically be leveraged. And I think that was one of the main points in Julie's like blog, is like basically having a plug and play system where you can kind of throw things away as needed and then evolve it. And I think that's kind of like a beautiful thing that what you're all building at Brex.
Yeah, I think it really surprised me when Julie wrote and shared that blog post, because we've been running a system like that for almost 2 years now, and for a little bit I thought, yeah, it's probably unique, like there's probably not a lot of other people doing it. um but now, after hearing some of the responses she's gotten, now I kind of have the idea that, like, okay, like no one is really kind of approaching this problem like we do. um so I think the thing you're talking about is true. Like we try to build systems almost like with a services oriented architecture, right? Where we can plug and play, we can, you know, um, release a new version of Substation without having to upgrade our SIM, right? Or improve an enrichment without having to upgrade Substation, like that kind of thing. I think it's just a very modern take on the detection engineering problem space.
Very cool. So, obviously you talked about the scaling problem, and obviously, like, that's definitely like building something that can scale is important. But were there any other challenges when designing Substation at the beginning that kind of like you ran into, like just from like a more development focused aspect?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of experimentation and trying to make data-driven decisions. Um, Usually they go pretty well, but not always. Sometimes you have to use your gut. So, like some of the things we did early on, we tested, when we deployed a Lambda in AWS, like we only deploy containers just for ease of use, and so we tested like, how's the latency on cold starting a container versus cold starting code stored as a zip in S3, right? Like that was some experiments we ran early on. Tested Python versus Go. Um, Controversially made the decision to support multi-core in AWS Lambda. That was a bit of a confusion, I think, across the team when we first did that, because it's like, why would you support multi-core on a Lambda? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. But then kind of came back around when we started to add these. One of the cool things the project does is like there's a lot of high latency processing you need to do of data sometimes, and that's usually external enrichment, like doing DNS querying and querying like other systems. And because of some of the design decisions we made early on, we can do that at scale because we kind of had a weird idea to do multi-core and Lambda, right? That kind of thing. Um, I think I wouldn't say it was a struggle at first, but we went through a lot of iterations, and for the most part, the thing you see today is the thing we've been running for 2 years. But I don't know, I'd say internally we went through 3 different releases. It had a code name internally, it was different. Um, Before that, it had no code name. We just kind of like we're forced to give it a name because we couldn't think of what to call it every time we talked about it. It's kind of embarrassing. Um, but it's like systems evolve, right? And I think the major point is that like the thing that you see today is the thing we've done since day one, and that's cool, right? It means at least we got the architecture right, got most of the design right. Maybe some of the implementation details are different.
Very cool. And my final question, I have grilled you long enough. Have you seen like any organizations or like maybe even teams internally who might not be in the same space, like start to adopt this ever since like, Julie's blog post or when you first like, put this on LinkedIn or tweeted about it? Have you seen like any other teams start to adopt Substation or like organizations, companies?
Yeah, no one that I know of that has run it yet. There's some teams that I don't think I can name because I
Okay.
haven't gotten approval to name them. But yeah, I'm aware of some teams that are interested in it. Um, I One thing that like no one knows is that we actually released it in April and didn't tell anyone, and then we announced it. I don't know, a couple months ago. And the reason why we released it in April is just so we could kind of get it into people's like get their eyes in front of it, right, and getting opinions on it. And I quietly like shop it around to people that I respect and have worked with in the past, just to say like, does this seem right? Like, is this actually doing like solving the problem? And I think the feedback was generally pretty positive. And then I'll speak a little bit to Julie's blog post and kind of talking about our entire approach to detection engineering. I think um, that is a little easier to understand than data engineering, because security engineers, I don't know they love data engineering, but detection engineers definitely love detection engineering. So I think some of the feedback that she's gotten on that blog post about how we build things has kind of gotten a lot of traction with certain teams. And I know she's heard that like people are really interested in it. Like there's a lot of concepts in there that are just like, I don't want to say groundbreaking, but it's just a kind of a different like spin on things. And I suspect that there are other teams kind of doing this kind of work. Um, Maybe they haven't publicized it, but yeah, it's been cool. It's always fun, telling people a little bit about what you do, especially when it's we touch a lot of sensitive data and build a lot of sensitive things that are in some cases like highly confidential, right? Like if you actually told people about what you're doing, you might be you know, giving an adversary a lead on breaching your organization, right? So you have to be cautious about how you do that. Um, and I'm pretty happy with how we've kind of approached it so far. Like, you can't like look at Substation and have a clue about how we run it internally, right? It's just code. Like, that's the way we try to build tools, and the same for the blog post Julie did, where like you look at that and it's just like a big mess of systems, and like there's descriptions of those systems, but like how we actually use them to, detect bad guys, that's the mystery.
Very cool. The one thing I would love to see from Substation is just like wide adoption and like having a bunch of like new modules added, which would just basically like automatically make your detection better and then everyone else as well, which is why I kind of, love what you're doing. I'm upset because Eva is a cat. I believe it looks like a cat that just jumped in the background, but you have a blurred background, so I didn't get to see.
That's my
Uh,
that's my dog.
oh, your dog? Okay, dog. Also love dogs. But thank you for the great conversation. It's a great place to stop. So this was episode 21. Thanks so much, Josh. Until the next time.
Great chatting with you.